Welcome to the Science and Paranormal with Dr. Yana and Dr. Elliot, where science meets the unexpected, where we delve deep into the mysteries that straddle the line between scientific inquiry and paranormal. Get ready for a mind-altering journey as we embark on this phenomenal discovery together on United Public Radio Network 107.7 FM.
Welcome, everybody, to Science and the Paranormal with Dr. Elliot and the beautiful Dr. Yana. We have a very special guest tonight, don't we, Dr.?
We have a fantastic guest today, astrophysicist Dr. Hugh Ross. He's a founder, senior scholar, and former president of Reasons to Believe. He holds a degree in physics from the University of British Columbia and Ph.D. in astronomy from the University of Toronto. He's written incredible books, which include Why the Universe is the Way It Is, Improbable Planet, Designed to the Core, and what we are going to be discussing also today, his book Lights in the Sky and Little Green Men, a rational Christian look at UFOs and extraterrestrials. It is so interesting that the authors of this book initiated a search for truth to answer us about UFO sightings and extraterrestrial life using extensive scientific background and knowledge of the scriptures. They approach the questions, could life exist on other planets? Or does documentation exist on UFO sightings and landings? So we will be discussing all that today with fabulous Dr. Ross. Welcome.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Thank you very much for taking time and joining us today to discuss this incredible topic, because this topic is, of course, in the minds of thousands and thousands of people, and we need to bring science to this question. So, Dr. Ross, how did you come to investigating this topic at all?
Well, when I was 7 years of age, I got really interested in astronomy. I asked my parents, are the stars hot? And they said, yes, they are. I said, tell me, why are they hot? They said, go to the library. So I came back with 5 books on physics and astronomy. And that's what I do every Saturday. Go to the Vancouver Public Library and take home the maximum number of books in physics and astronomy. I wound up becoming an amateur astronomer, very involved in studying T-Tauri type variable stars when I was 14, 15, 16. And I was made the director of observations for the Royal Astronomical Society Vancouver chapter. And I said, hey, we need a booth at the Pacific National Exhibition. So we had this booth, but they put us right next to the Flying Saucer Club. And so people would talk to the folks at the Flying Saucer booth, and they come to us and say, well, what do you think? And so since I knew the night sky really well, people would come to me and say, hey, and what I discovered was that every university I participated in, whether it was the University of British Columbia, University of Toronto, or when I did my postdoctoral research at Caltech, I was assigned the job of processing UFO reports that came into the university. And I was beginning to think, all of this stuff is something that can be explained naturally, because most of what people reported to me was like a fireball, the planet Venus, the rising Pleiades. And I got used to asking the question, were your eyes fully dark adapted? Because when you go from a lit room to a dark setting at night, it takes about 20 minutes before your eyes stop seeing lights that are not there. So I would discount everything where the observers weren't fully dark adapted. But over the years, I found that I could explain about 99% of what people were reporting to me as natural phenomena, secret military activity, or hoaxes. I mean, the universities I attended the students love to pull off UFO hoaxes.
Mm-hmm.
I'm very expert in dealing with that. But there was a 1% residual that didn't fall into any of those categories. And what I noticed about that 1% residual, you could prove that the phenomenon was real, but it wasn't physical. It violated the laws of physics. So we're dealing with something that's non-physical and real. And I'm not the only physicist that's drawn that conclusion. I know of 6 physicists that have spent at least a decade studying the UFO phenomena. They've written books on it, but they all agree we're dealing with something interdimensional, something that's beyond the space-time dimensions of this universe, something that's not subject to the laws of physics. So the other 6, they're not Christians like I am. As a Christian, I would say, well, God created 2 distinct species of intelligent life. One species as human beings that is constrained by the laws of physics and the space-time dimensions, and angels that are not so constrained. But the Bible also makes it clear they're not permanent residents of a realm. They come for a brief time and they exit. And I see that consistent with the 1% residual, that the encounters people have are brief episodic encounters, with some rare exceptions. What's interesting to me, I've run into people who have repeated encounters with the 1%, and they tend to have much longer exposures with the interdimensional entities that are behind all this. So that's a quick background of how I got into all of this. And to this day, people come to me with their UFO stories. And what caused me to write the book was a trip I made to the Soviet Union when the communists were still running the show. And I found that the incidence of UFO experiences was a good order of magnitude higher than it is here in the US.
What year was it?
That would have been 89 and 90. And
Ooh, tumultuous time.
well, it was, but what was interesting, I was actually sponsored by the Soviet government, an organization called the Soviet Lab. And I remember what they told me when I arrived in the country. They said, "You're our guest, and we're only going to let you speak to people with doctoral degrees in science and engineering. And they get to choose what you want you to speak on." Because I came with 30 different talks on science and technology and faith issues. And they said, your audience will pick the talks. You won't. And they'll pick them when you arrive. So you need to be ready to give all 30 because you don't know which one you're going to give.
Oh, those tough Russians.
Wow, that's amazing. Even your background being in British Columbia, because our west coast of Canada, BC for a long time has been kind of a hotspot for UFO sightings, whereas on the East Coast, we're rich in folklore, we're rich in ghost and apparitional stories. So that would have been a really cool place to be studying astronomy, and really cool how you got into it at, how you had a UFO organization next to astronomy organization. That's really cool.
And at the age of 16.
Yeah, well, I mean, I was kind of a nerd, so it's like I was really deep into studying astronomy. I was actually doing research, even writing papers at that age. So I was actually the youngest member of the Vancouver chapter of but they said, hey, we'll make you the director because you're the one that's most steeped in all this. So
that's so fascinating. I find a lot relatable to you because, we were talking before we went on air, and I had started my nonprofit organization when I was 16, research investigation, which still exists today. And before that, to get some practical field investigation experience, I had joined my mentor, Dr. Darrell Walsh's organization, the Center for Parapsychological Studies in Canada, and I was probably his youngest member as well. There was no other teenagers in his organization. And I remember at the time when the internet was becoming popular, I had helped him design a website, and he had made me his director of internet operations. And I still have the certificate on my back wall there. It's underneath my university degree there. So it's, Yeah, I find that absolutely amazing, and that's so
What is
cool.
so Yeah, but what is so interesting is that that mission in our lives is revealed early, and we took note of that and we acted on that. So interesting that you did it at the 17, 16, and 17, and I at that time also uh, got the message of where my life should be, in which direction it should be unfolding. And at that time I was actually having encounters with the extraterrestrials, but I, in fact, didn't do anything about it. So I just took note, and I wrote those experiences down. And in fact, the same um, entities made their appearance 25 years later. So that is so interesting. But I have a burning question. I know that many scientists, they are non-believers. And you found your faith much later, like not coming from a particularly religious background of upbringing in your family. You were looking for answers, and you did find them in Christianity. How do you reconcile your scientific knowledge of the universe and Christianity, faith in God?
Well, it began when I was 16. And that's when I took a year out to study cosmology, a sub-discipline of astronomy about the origin of the universe. And there was a lot of debate at that time. Is it Big Bang? Is it a steady state? Is it an oscillating universe? But even then, the evidence was heavily favoring Big Bang. And I knew if it was Big Bang, the universe had a beginning. If it had a beginning, there was a cosmic beginner. So, as at age 17, I said, I need to find that cosmic beginner. Really had no idea where to look. I started reading the great philosophers. Immanuel Kant, read his Critique of Pure Reason, realized he had the wrong concepts of space and time. And then I started to go through the different holy books that undergirded the world's religions. When I studied the Hindu Vedas, I said, oh, this is where the oscillating universe comes from. Because in Hinduism, it's all about reincarnation, which is founded on the concept that the universe reincarnates. But I knew that was physically impossible. So I said, the truth is not in Hinduism. I next looked at Buddhism, discovered they had the same cosmology as the Hindus. I looked at the Quran. I noticed they had 3 different creation accounts, but they contradicted one another. And finally, I did pick up a Bible. And when I began to go through it, I realized this is the one book that actually predicted the fundamental features of Big Bang cosmology thousands of years before astronomers discovered them. So I said, maybe this book really is uh, a message from the one that created the universe. I spent 2 years putting it to a rigorous scientific test. At the end of that, I realized this book has predicted future scientific discoveries accurately over 100 times. And I realized that would be impossible for any human authors to achieve unless they were inspired by the one that did the deed. So, as at age 19, I signed my name in the back of a Gideon Bible that was given to me in the public school, committing my life to Jesus Christ. Went on to get a Ph.D. in astronomy. And it's when I arrived at Caltech that I met a serious Christian. I mean, Elliot, you're in Canada. I remember being in Toronto trying to find a church where people actually believed the Bible was the inerrant word of God. Didn't really know how to find a church. Today, I would know how to do that. Back then, I didn't. And so I basically gave up on church. But when I came to Caltech, there was another astronomer there who was a Christian and said, here's a list of 6 Bible believing churches. Check them out. So I did. I picked one. And 7 months later, they put me on their pastoral staff to train
Hmm.
people how to use science as a tool to persuade people that Jesus Christ is Creator, Lord, and Savior. And it's that church that helped me launch Reasons to Believe back in 1985.
Wow. That's amazing, and it's so true, like you said. Depending on which church you go to, they each kind of have their own little different kind of spin on things as well. So it's nice that you found one that you were looking for. Yeah, I find that absolutely unbelievable. I know you do a lot of speaking on this topic, both here in North America and overseas. How do you find the difference between doing your lectures here in North America versus Europe? I know there's a lot of different beliefs between the two continents, and it's always been fascinating to hear it from the ghost side of things, but I'd be interested in hearing from the UFO side of things.
Well, for me, there's not a lot of difference because usually they have me speak in front of skeptics and atheists. And I find that the ones in Europe are kind of like the same ones you find here in North America. And I found the same thing is true when I go to Africa and to Asia. So it's like, and the Bible tells us that people are not that different from one another. So, but I think it's partly a selection effect that I'm usually speaking to people who have a STEM background and have a strong skepticism. So that's been my background. And I remember telling you about my trip to the Soviet Union. It's interesting. I gave 22 lectures. No, actually, I gave almost 30 lectures. And over half of them, the audience said, we want you to speak on UFOs.
Wow.
So, yeah. So
the Soviets, yeah, they have a great UFO history. They actually do quite a bit of parapsychological work as well. But we just, Dr. Yan and I have talked about this before. We don't seem to get the information out of there. There was a lady over there that used to be able to perform psychokinesis, and I know some psychologists had gone over from North America to study her, but it was the same thing, almost like what you described. The Russians had it very controlled. They couldn't take them to the parapsychological laboratory to study Nina Kulingina. It was.
I found out why, because when I went back in '94, the level of interest in UFOs and the paranormal had plummeted. It had dropped way down from what it was in the late 1980s. And I think the difference was back in the 1980s, their major scientific institutions were sponsoring research on occult physics. And it was all very secretive because they were hoping to develop occult weapons they could use against the West. But with perestroika, that disappeared. And along with it, interest in the paranormal and people's experiences with UFOs plummeted. And that was a key reason why in our book, Lights in the Sky and Little Green Men, I said there's a definite connection between the level of involvement in occult research and the encounters that people have with UFOs.
That's fascinating. Yeah,
I've never heard about occult physics. Could that be metaphysics, or that is a particular niche in the science that the Soviets invented?
Well, it's not unique to the Soviets. I actually knew some physicists at Caltech that were doing this in their homes, not at Caltech. They were just personally interested in this, and particularly interested in getting objects to levitate on their own, metal objects. And they thought that they were going to be discovering some hidden laws of physics. But what I noticed is that both in Russia and here in the United States, it was limited to individuals who were heavily involved in the occult. And therefore, that's why I think, yes, they made contact with an angelic being. And it's the angelic being that's able to violate the laws of physics. But it's interesting how these physicists thought, we're on a way to a breakthrough of finding a new law of physics, because they were just fascinated by this phenomena they were seeing. And here in the US, it was like, okay, we can levitate these metal objects without using magnets. But in the Soviet Union, they were seriously wanting to see if they could develop weapons out of this.
That is so fascinating, because I know that, of course, Russian education in Russian universities is a very strong one. And moving here to United States, I have also discovered that the majority of faculty in the mathematics, astrophysics departments, they come from Russia.
Well, I noticed that too, is that because when I went to Russia in the 80s and 90s, early 90s, is that their level of technology was significantly below what we take routinely for granted in the West. And so I discovered is their best scientists go into theoretical physics and mathematics because they knew they went into experimental physics, they'd be dealing with subpar technology. And so they said,
Mm,
look, we want to be able to do frontline research. And so Americans discovered that and began to recruit these Russian physicists because that's where the most talented and brilliant uh, scientists in Russia wound up. And I see that to this day is that, for example, the space-time theorems that proved that space and time were created, a lot of that work was done by Russian theoretical physicists.
That is very interesting to hear that. I studied mostly the social sciences, so I wonder if it. I mean, you studied Canada. Did you find it was the same for Canadian universities in the physics department? Did they have a lot of Russian scientists teaching?
Well, we would invite Russians to come because we knew that they were quite talented. But we also knew not to invite the experimentalists because, you know, in fact, when I was in Russia, when they found out I did observational astronomy, did you bring any of your equipment with you? I said no. And so they very much wanted, hoping that I secretly stashed some in my case that they could use. Because I remember talking to radio astronomers, our receivers were 1,000 times more sensitive than theirs. So, in fact, when we would do work with the Russians, we would bring our own equipment over. They had good telescopes, but the back end equipment was significantly subpar. Now, by the way, that's all changed with perestroika. Western technologies come in, and now the Russians are developing their own. But during the Soviet era, it's like everything has to be internal. So they didn't have the transistors that the West had available. I,
interesting that you say that because looks like the Russians were the first who orbited the moon, and then here in United States we had the incredible race to outsmart the Russians to get to the moon. And as an astrophysicist, could you debunk all those conspiracy theories and tell us whether we were actually on the moon or not?
we were definitely on the moon. I mean, you can. I tell people there's three laser reflectors that the Apollo astronauts put on the moon, and we astrophysicists send laser beams up to those reflectors on a daily basis to develop a better test of the theory of general relativity. In fact, I remember watching the Apollo 11 landing live when I was a graduate student, and I was very interested to watch the astronaut place that first laser reflector on the moon. And literally within a few days, they were using that from ground-based lasers. In fact, I've written articles how the last 50 years of research on that has enabled us to come up with a much more, uh, a much better confirmation of the theory of general relativity and apply that to our cosmological models. So, and I can actually show you photographs of craft that are still left on the moon because they didn't bring them back. They just left them there on the moon. And there's satellites orbiting the moon. So it's been photographed many times.
That would be very nice to see, and for me personally, even. So, Dr. Ross, if you visited the Soviet Union in the 80s, then were the Soviets technologically more advanced in the 60s when they orbited the moon than the West?
Well, that's what
Didn't
we
things changed?
what we discovered is they would pour a lot more money into it, and they built things big. The rockets were bigger,
Hmm.
so they just put more energy, more money into it. But the American rockets had 100 times more moving parts and had a lot of miniaturization because we were trying to do it without spending a lot of money. And I remember the first time I was in the Soviet Union, they said, "We really fooled you in the West into thinking that we were more advanced than you were." It was literally the other way around. In fact, I remember the first lecture I gave there. I said, can I use a projector? They said, we don't have projectors here in the Soviet Union. And I said, well, okay, I'll just use the blackboard back here. And they said, our blackboards don't work. Our chalk doesn't work. We can give you a microphone. That's it. So I had to do everything just through an audio microphone. But when I went back in 94, they all had Western technology in place. Projectors were in place, and they had nice blackboards. The food was way better. And I discovered why, because they imported it from the Netherlands and West Germany. So, however, I remember being taken to a Dachau by one of the KGB leaders.
Ooh.
He had a wonderful vegetable garden. He knew I liked vegetables, so I spent an afternoon there. But I also realized the astronomers and physicists there, they kept talking about these cockroaches. I said, well, what are these cockroaches? They said, each one of us has a KGB agent that watches his work. You want to know why things don't happen very fast here in the Soviet Union? Half the people are watching, the other half work. So, which is why they gave them the nickname cockroach. So they don't do any work, they just watch us. So
interesting because the recent movie with Tom Hanks, I don't remember exactly what it was called, but that was the race that Tom Hanks was overseeing the program itself to get the America, essentially United States, to the moon. And it was very interesting to me, in fact, coming with a background living in Soviet Union. To me, it was very interesting that in United States, it was such an interesting position. The astrophysics was in a very peculiar position that they were really upset that the Russians orbited the moon first. And to me, I don't think that I gave it too much thought ever, but I was surprised to see that we were here in the United States so behind, that it was a source of essentially the pain that people went through, that the Russians outdid them and went to the moon first. So it was a surprise for me.
I personally benefited that, because the idea that the Russians were ahead of us in science is that I had the opportunity, I was in high school, to spend 3 years getting science lectures from the professors at the university. That would have never happened if there wasn't this, hey, we're behind, we got to catch up with the Russians. So personally benefited from that. But whenever I would meet Russian scientists, I said, boy, we really fooled you. So, because they really envied the technology that we had. So, and of course, today they have it. So,
that's incredible. I know that many scientists today reflect on the possibility of non-physical reality. So, is there any independent scientific proof of non-physical reality?
well, that's what I noticed when I began to study, thousands of these UFO reports that were coming to me, is that there would be reports where they could see a UFO going through the atmosphere. And when you got 3 or 4 geographically separated witnesses, you can do triangulation on it and actually determine the velocity that it goes through the atmosphere. And we're talking in excess of 5,000 miles per hour, as high as 25,000 miles per hour. And it's like, if it's a physical object, you're going to hear loud sonic booms. You're going to see heat friction trailing the object going through the atmosphere. And there's no heat trails, there's no sonic booms. And there's actually over 2,000 cases where observers have watched the UFO crash into the Earth. And you go to the crash site, there's a shallow crater. Something made that crater. And some of them are as deep as 18 inches. And there's snow, the snow is melted. And always the vegetation in the area is damaged. But when you go to the crater site, there's no debris, there's no artifacts. I mean, if it's a physical object, we know what happens when an airplane crashes. There's all kinds of debris. In the case of these UFOs, no debris, no artifacts, no sonic boom. And of course, the pilots, they report seeing these craft make sharp right angle turns, at 15,000 miles per hour. No physical object can withstand those G forces. So that's why I drew the conclusion that this 1% residual falls in the category of being non physical but real. And I remember sharing that with Carl Sagan when I had him briefly as a professor at the University of Toronto. And he was extremely dismissive of this concept of UFOs. But what I realized as an atheist, he denied the reality of non physical reality. He says, if it's real, it's got to be physical. And so that explains why so many scientists are dismissive of that 1% residual, because their worldview doesn't tolerate the possibility of non physical reality. But mine does. And so I took this seriously. And like Alan Hynek in the 1960s, I became interested in people who had the close encounters. And like Alan Hynek, the American astrophysicist that was commissioned by the US government to investigate the phenomena, I concluded the people that have the close encounters, the experience is always deleterious. It's never beneficial. The best you're going to come away from is recurring, terrifying nightmares. Worst case scenario, there's documented cases where people have been killed by the encounter. So this is why I drew the conclusion. We're not dealing with the righteous angels. We're dealing with the fallen angels. They're out to harm us. They're out to deceive us. And what I notice is when people have messages in these close encounters, the information they're given, we can show is not scientifically correct, but it's at the level of what people understand about space physics. So if you go back 100 years ago, 150 years ago, the claim was that they were beings from the backside of the moon. But once the general public became aware, well, that's not possible, they changed their story and said we're from Venus. And when people realized how hot it is on Venus, they said they were from Mars. The story we're hearing today is they're from another planetary system, which is why I'm in the process of writing an update to Lights in the Sky and Little Green Men, basically saying we astronomers are actually trying to send spacecraft to the nearest planetary systems, and we recognize that the laws of physics will not allow us to send a spaceship any bigger than 10 centimeters across. And if we send them where they're that big, we need to send at least 1,000 of them in order to have one or two sufficiently undamaged that we can get back some meaningful information. Which is why I don't think the story that they're from another planetary system can be credible unless they really are beings from another dimension.
That's really interesting because, like you said, throughout the UFO history, you've heard that, that they come from the moon and then Venus and then Mars. I know in the Betty and Barney Hill abduction case, they drew out the star system Zeta Relicta. And then I believe I just read an article not too long ago, almost talking very similar to what you're talking about, is coming up with these like micro satellites and using lasers to zap them to Alpha Centauria, which can go not quite as fast as the speed of light, but a lot faster than what we can travel conventionally right now. And like you said, launch a ton of them so that if any of them get lost or damaged, at least we have a few there to send some data back.
Now, that's actually a serious project that is likely to be funded. Sending 1,000 tiny spaceships to Alpha Centauri. We know there's a planet orbiting Proxima Centauri, and people are very interested in saying, wouldn't it be great to get direct measurements up close of that planet? So that's a serious proposal. And because the spaceships are tiny, they're not that expensive. The downside is it's going to take a long time to get there and get the signals sent back to the Earth.
Yeah, a lot faster than what we could do it if it was a conventional spaceship. But you're right; it's still going to take. I think the article said it was like 2 years just to get there, and then it would be obviously a couple more years for the data to come back. So you're looking at by the time you get all this in place, it's
They're
going to
actually
take
saying 40 years because it's 4.25 light years away.
40 years. Wow.
And they said if we go 1/5 the velocity of light, the damage to the spaceship will be too great. None of them will make it. We need to go only 1/10 the velocity of light. People think interstellar space is a vacuum. It's not. There's protons and neutrons out there. And if you're moving really fast, they can do significant damage over the course of the journey. And so the plan is to send them at 1/10 the velocity of light. Now you're looking at 42 years to make a one-way trip.
So you have one generation send it out, and then the next generation
Right,
Yes,
studying the data based on that. Yeah.
right.
this is fantastic. Absolutely amazing conversation. And we are live on United Public Radio Network 107.7 FM on Science and the Paranormal with Dr. Elliot and myself, Dr. Yana. And today we are talking with an incredible Dr. Hugh Ross. Dr. Ross, what do you think about George Van Tassel and his integratron that he started building in the late 50s in the Joshua Tree uh, Park here in California? Because he said that he met creatures from entities from Venus. And of course, as a psychologist, you would want to investigate the credibility of this person, whether he had any kind of psychological deviations. But listening to his interviews, you would think that that was a person of scientific background because he was mechanic, aircraft mechanic, and the flight inspector who moved to California's Mojave Desert to operate an airport. So then somehow accidentally he encountered those beings that gave him the blueprint to build the integratron. However, the integratron was not finished exactly, and as they claim that he was killed or he died 2 weeks before the completion, and not one single engineer or scientist is able to replicate it or to finish or was able to finish it because now it is unfinished and it's doing something else. And of course, what he intended it to be, it's this incredible integratron structure for rejuvenation of human bodies and cells as a scientific structure, it did not take place. What do you think about it?
Well, he's not alone. I mean, there's been a lot of stories like that in the UFO literature. And, my investigation, again, I'm not alone. Several other physicists have likewise dived into this and said, we see no evidence that there's technology we're getting from these interdimensional beings that's beyond the technology what we're able to achieve without their help. And of course, there's stories going back to the ancient Egyptians had contacts with these beings, and that explains why they were able to build the pyramids to such high precision. But what I've discovered is the ancient peoples all over the world were building stone observatories like you see at Stonehenge. And if you don't have telescopes, these huge stone structures are basically designed to be gun sites. And what they now notice is that around these stone observatories, you've got these long straight roads that go out several miles. The astronomer would stand back 2 or 3 miles and use a stone structure as a gun sight to make measurements of stars and planets. And they could increase the precision of the position measurement by 5 or 6 times without any optical aid, just using those. And we now know the ancients built thousands of these stone observatories all over the world. So it really was no big deal for the Incas or the Aztecs or the Egyptians to build these amazing structures. Number one, they put a lot of money towards it and a lot of labor. We would never, put 70,000 workers to build a structure, but they would. And there was a time at the height of the Egyptian Empire when the team of astronomers were given 25% of the gross national product. Makes me as an astronomer envious because all we get from the US government is way less than 0.025%, but they got 25%.
Ay,
So,
ay, ay.
which tells us they didn't need any extraterrestrial help to achieve the technological things that they were able to perform. And they weren't stupid. They all knew that the Earth was a sphere. They knew the sun was the center of the solar system. We think they're backward. We don't take into account they didn't have algebra. If you don't have algebra, the only way you can determine the future positions of the planets is to use plane geometry. And that only works if you make the Earth the center of the solar system rather than the sun. So the ancients actually knew otherwise, but they couldn't make the math work from a sun center perspective. They could from an Earth center perspective. And once they had algebra, then hey, they went with the sun center perspective.
But if
So,
they had algebra at that time and they knew all of those facts before, what happened to our Middle Ages with Giordano Bruno and Copernicus when they tried to prove it mathematically, astronomically, and the Christian world would not listen? What happened? Did we regress into the Dark Ages?
well, the Dark Ages weren't that dark. That's when universities were founded throughout Christian Europe. And yes, it was the Islamic mathematicians that invented algebra.
Yes.
So humans didn't have algebra until the 9th century AD. That was a major contribution of Islamic scientists was to come up with the mathematics of algebra.
I had
And
a friend once, and he was from Amman. And when I told him, I said that the Arabs invented the algebra, he was so relieved. He said, thank you for admitting that because nobody else talks about it. So he was absolutely happy about it.
yeah, and the Christians in Europe quickly adopted it, and this is
Yes.
things began to. That's what led to the Renaissance and all that. So
But Dr. Ross, if you as a Christian and the man of science with background in astrophysics, what do you think about scientists also delving into the occult physics? What is your relationship with occult physics? What do you think about it? What what in occult physics can be of a value to you, or
yeah,
the
good,
principles of occult physics?
right. Um, what's interesting about these UFO encounters, their most common encounter is at 3 a.m. in the morning on a lonely country road. That's where you see the
Mm-hmm.
highest level of incidence. But guess who hangs out at lonely country roads at 3 a.m. in the morning? Professional astronomers. That's where
Aha.
the telescopes are. And of course, we build roads to get to our telescopes. But surveys show that astronomers have a very low incidence of encounters with UFOs. However, I do remember an exception. There were two astronomers that would come on our radio telescope that I used in Canada, and they would have maybe 3 or 4 hours of observing time once a year. But every time they came on the telescope, they had a close encounter with these UFO interdimensional entities. And I remember saying, hey, I'm logging 1,500 hours a year. I don't have anything like that happening. And I knew several other astronomers are all getting more than 1,000 hours on the telescope. We weren't seeing anything like this. But I knew that those two astronomers were both deep into occult physics.
Mm-hmm.
And what I know from my Christian background, these fallen angels cannot invade your life unless you give them permission. And you give them permission through trying to seek power through the occult, which is why the Bible warns us always put truth at a higher level than power. If you put power ahead of truth, you will be deceived, and don't be surprised if you have these encounters with these interdimensional beings. So,
Power ahead of truth. That is
yes.
incredible. So, do you think that the extraterrestrials, are not making contact with you, for example, personally, or just making themselves visible to just ordinary people who don't have any background in science? Do you think that they just want to do their business here on Earth, whatever mission that they may have covertly? And if they were to uh, reveal themselves to you or to other scientists, that you would be able to do your research and unveil the truth about the extraterrestrial life sooner?
Well, that's not going to happen because I'm staying away from the occult. And that's
So,
why we made our
mhm.
point in the book that what we're claiming is to have a scientifically testable explanation of these residual, the 1% of what people report as UFOs, basically making the point that the level of incidence of people having UFO encounters is proportional to the percentage of the population that are involved in the occult. So, for example, the percentages are much higher in France than they are in the United States, but there's a much higher proportion of the French population involved in the occult. And Elliot, I remember you mentioned British Columbia, where I've seen the highest incidence in North America is Alaska, British Columbia, and Hawaii. But those are three places where you got a higher percentage of the population involved in the occult.
I was just looking into doing some research there for a television show, and you're right. BC actually had the Satanic Panic back in the I think it was the '80s,
Right.
with the book Remembering Michelle, or Michelle Remembering. I might have it mixed up, but it was basically a psychiatrist that ended up dating his patient, and they found out they wrote a book, and they found out it was all nonsense, but it had created quite a bit of satanic panic in BC at the time. And they also have a lot of witchcraft camps that I didn't know about. Apparently
Right.
they have, yeah, witchcraft camps you can go to, and yeah, all kinds of paranormal stuff out there in BC. So I'm not surprised to hear that. I had a special guest speaker last year at the 2023 Halifax Paranormal Symposium. It was our first ever symposium that we held here in Nova Scotia, and I had brought Dr. Richard Gallagher there, and he is a psychiatrist at Columbia University that believes in demonic possession. But at the end of his lecture, actually, he started talking very much what we're talking about tonight. He had touched on UFOs, and he had touched on the experience of extraterrestrials and linked them to being same thing, fallen angels. And I know that upset some hardcore kind of UFO followers that were there, because they kind of believe in the typical extraterrestrial hypotheses. But it was first, I guess, when Dr. Gallagher was talking about that I had started to hear about this. And now that I've heard it, I've heard it from different people, and like tonight. So I
Well,
find it really interesting to mention like the extraterrestrial and demonic link, because some people even believe when they looked at the Anunnaki scripts that Michael the Archangel and Gabriel, that they might not necessarily have been talking about angels, but they could have been talking about like the ships of God, and that was their name. So it was, God's army of Michael and God's army of Gabriel that were coming to do battle. So I find it all very, very interesting, because I mean, I'm interested in the paranormal, but I also have an interest in demonology and ufology. So I find it absolutely mind blowing.
well, you mentioned the extraterrestrial hypothesis. I find that that typically is what people think is responsible for UFOs, beings like us on another planet. And this is why, as an astrophysicist, I said, no, wait a minute. We can't even find a star that's sufficiently like the sun that it could be a candidate to have a planet orbiting it on which advanced life like us is possible. So the idea that, nowhere in our galaxy can we find another candidate star. And now we're looking, if you're going beyond our galaxy, you're looking at over 1 million light years. And so the light travel times are very, very long. because if they're beings like us, they're constrained by the velocity of light. And so I think we can definitively rule out, just based on astrophysics, the extraterrestrial physical hypothesis, which leaves you with what Jacques Vallée has said. We are dealing with interdimensional beings. And yes, they don't seem to be wanting to benefit us. They're out to harm us and deceive us. And I've interviewed a lot of people that have had the close encounters. People tell me, look, nothing bad has happened to me. It's because they didn't have a close encounter. When you have a close encounter, like Alan Hynek defined, that's when you begin to experience the unpleasant consequences. And so people come to me and they say, hey, do you want to get rid of this? They say, yeah, I don't want anything to do with this. Get the occult out of your life. That'll be the end of your UFO encounters. There's
Well,
a
if we look, well, I have a question for you. Very interesting question. That I know that my first encounter was at the time when I was 14, and I was giving interesting messages from them of the awful events that would happen in the future, and indeed they happened. To the proportions of in 1990, there was a enormous earthquake in Iran that took the life of thousands of people. And I was not involved in the occult. And I know that those were not particularly demons, because I was not in any particular religious current at the time. And what I remember when I was studying the Bible, having the doing the bachelor's in religious studies, what was perplexing to me is that even the Abraham, for example, if we study the Old Testament, the five books of Moses, if we look at that, the Bible warns us. Be kind to anyone that comes along, because you could be encountering the angels, because for example he wasn't even intending to see anyone, and all of a sudden two angels came along and he offered them food. And
right.
there's so many encounters like that in the Old Testament, and they were not involved in the occult. So what is your opinion on that?
Well, the New Testament, Hebrews 13:2, says what you stated. Many of you have entertained angels unawares. And that's a message to Christians, basically saying that God will send one or more of the righteous angels to assist you in your ministry of serving Him. But they come for usually just a few seconds, then they're gone. And you see examples of that in the book of Acts, where God would send an angel to deliver Peter from his imprisonment. But it was a brief encounter and they were gone. And, as a pastor in our church between Caltech and the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, I've heard stories of people saying, yeah, my car was broken down. It's the middle of the night. I was freezing. And out of nowhere, this guy drove up, fixed my car, and was gone. And I didn't even see the car drive off. The car disappeared. So it's like, okay, maybe that's Hebrews 13 too. My concern, though, is people encountering the fallen angels. And and I tell people, you got to be careful, because we're told to test the spirits to see whether we're dealing with the righteous or the fallen. And you may have nothing in the occult in your life, but if your grandfather does, that's one thing that the Bible tells us. These fallen angels can make a path through a close relative. And I remember talking to a young man who was having repeated close encounters with UFOs. And he assured me, he says, look, I've done everything you said. I got the alcohol completely out of my life. I said, well, are you in a relationship right now? He says, yes, I'm in a relationship with this woman. And I said, well, is it a sexual relationship? And he said, yes, it is. Tell me about this woman. Well, she's a witch. Well, that's what happened to you. If you don't want any more of these UFO experiences, you need to break that relationship and confess that the relationship that you had with her is something that is displeasing to God. Repent of it, and he did that, and that was the end of his UFO experiences. But I
So
mean,
little green men are in fact the dark entities, the extraterrestrials, which in Christianity are called demons, or the
right.
extraterrestrials are demons, are totally different entities.
Yeah, the Bible uses the term demon to refer to
Uh-huh.
fallen angels. And
And
was
fallen angels are extraterrestrials.
they're interdimensional. They're not constrained by the dimensions of our universe,
Hmm.
but they
Interdimensionals.
need permission to visit you. So, uh, and in that context, what I notice is that the level of incidence here in the United States isn't that great. But even here in the United States, there are four major UFO religions where people are wanting to facilitate contact
Hmm.
with these creatures. And you're probably aware that a number of these individuals have had a very close encounter where they go into a trance. And while they're in a trance, they wind up typing on a computer. And actually,
Hmm.
you know, articles come out that way, even entire books. The Urantia book is a book that is claimed to have been communicated from a UFO being to a human that was in a trance. What's interesting about that book, it's a very big book, and it's kind of the Bible for at least two of these four UFO religions operating here in the United States. A third of the content of that book is denying the deity of Jesus Christ. And it's like, why all the focus
Hmm.
denying who Jesus Christ is, unless it's from angelic beings that are on a mission to do everything they can to prevent people from developing a relationship with the creator of the universe.
There's a lot
Very
of
fascinating, Dr. Ross. I have a question for you. For in demonic investigations, the demonic can manifest in different ways. A lot of times, I had a case, for example, where a child was communicating with what he thought was another child in his
Right.
room. And through the course of the investigation, we found out that he may have been actually communicating with a demon or a jinn from the Quran named Malik. And he had actually drawn a picture for his mother of a stick figure with like swirls around it. And she had asked him what it was. And he said, "Oh, it's the little boy that plays in the fire in my toy room that I talk to all the time." And so we were quite concerned about that. With contactees and abductees, they've talked about different images of extraterrestrials. They've talked about the grays appearing to them. They've talked about reptilians appearing to them. What's your thought on that? I think
No,
it's just another way that the phonic's manifesting to somebody, and that's how we as humans are perceiving that information.
I hear a lot of stories like that where, in the middle of the night, they'll see one, two, or three of these apparitions come into their bedroom. And what's interesting is that they all struggle giving a detailed description of what they see. But they also claim that the encounter is quite terrifying and that they're trying to do everything they can to keep these entities at a distance,
hmm.
turning the light on or whatever they need to do. And and in several of those stories that have come to me, I said, "Well, how long have you lived in the home?" And they said, "Well, my parents just bought the house." And so I'll talk to the parents and discover the previous owners were holding seances in that house and was in that very room where the seances were happening, which explains why their son was having these experiences, but none of the other members of the family were. Because the parents were very dismissive. Oh, this is just you having a bad dream. But the fact that the dreams were happening virtually every night and that the child was afraid to go to sleep. I mean, for a child afraid to go to sleep at night, that's really abnormal. But uh, once they actually went into that room, found some occult articles, got rid of it, had some people come and just say, "Hey, we need to cleanse this whole house and just repent of what the people were doing here before we bought the house." Once they did all that, their son was able to sleep peaceably every night. No more terrifying nightmares, no incidences where he's wide awake at night and seeing these apparitions coming towards his bed and just cowering in fear. All that went away.
Because when those entities are conjured, they're not going anywhere until they are being sent away. And of course, if they took possession of that room or that house, they will be residing there. And children, of course, will be seeing them and possibly having night terrors.
I find it interesting as well too, like what you mentioned, how as parents we seem to quickly dismiss kids' experiences like that.
Hmm.
You know, as an investigator of the paranormal, I find we hear that all the time. The child will be expressing an experience that they've had, and parents are just quick to kind of shoo it away and say, "Oh, it was a bad dream," or it's just something in your head, and don't worry about it, kind of thing. But I find that a lot of people try and yeah, they dismiss the kids' experiences, which are interesting.
Yeah, I mean, if it's happening every night or almost every night, and the child is afraid to go to sleep, you need to take that seriously. Because
I
that's,
agree.
yeah.
That is so interesting and such a fantastic conversation. And not only that, we learned about the UFOs and also what to do and what not to do in order not to get ourselves into different type of predicaments. A lot of the times nowadays, because of the availability of all sorts of literature, um, people do uh, cause so many different entities to come through, and that becomes the part of the problem, and not the momentarily for them, but it stays with them, and it does what it can with their descendants as well. So it is a very important information to know and be careful. And it is not a game. It is not anything fun to do a Ouija board or anything else that comes with it, just to see who is there, because that can be very dangerous. There are entities, there are forces that are much stronger than us, or even those angels in our perception, what they are, what they can do, which can be so destructive that can even end your life. So we have to be very careful in where we step and what we do, what we touch with our hands.
No, that's well said. I mean, and people need to be aware these beings can take whatever form they want. I mean, they can appear as a flying saucer, they can appear as a leprechaun. And I think what really fools people, they can appear as your dead father. So they can come back and take
That's true.
form. And people think, hey, I was talking with my father from the dead. But I remember there's one individual saying, my father came to me in 1938 and it told me everything that was going to happen, that there'd be a war, and that all my brothers would go overseas, but I would stay home. He said everything I was told came true. I says, well, when you're in 1938, I think there was more than one or two people were aware a war was going to happen. There was a lot of evidence that was going to happen. And what really got me is that this entity that took the form of this man's dead father said, son, let me tell you something. If anybody says there's anything like eternal life, I'm telling you that's wrong. I know that is wrong. And I remember saying, well, isn't that a contradiction?
Exactly, because he was existing
Why?
eternally.
How can that be your dead father? So it gives you an idea of the deception that come upon these people, that they can't even spot the contradictions that are so obvious.
We become pretty gullible when it comes to our loved ones appearing to us, of course, and our critical thinking goes out of the roof, which we need to keep on the close leash with us, that critical thinking.
Right.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Ross, for coming and having this incredible conversation. We hope sincerely that you can come and share with us your other messages and talk about your other books, which I believe are going to be very interesting for our viewers and listeners, and they will learn a lot of wisdom from you. So
I'd be
thank
happy
you so
to do that.
much.
It's been a
That
pleasure dialoguing with the both of you.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. For today, our conversation, our podcast and radio show has come to the end. And we were live on United Public Radio Network 107.7 FM on Science and Paranormal. You were listening to Dr. Hugh Ross, Dr. Elliot, and Dr. Yana having an incredible conversation on science and UFOs. Have a great night, everyone. Good night and have good dreams. No nightmares tonight. Good night, everyone.
Good night, and it was a pleasure meeting you, Dr. Ross.
Well, likewise.